is that it means that in order for any group of people to genuinely create something good and new in the world, we desperately need those old stories and traditions. Those old stories and traditions that we often think of as, sometimes being like a ball and chain around our neck that keep us from progressing, keep us from doing something good, keep us from inventing something new. Those old stories and traditions, on the contrary, actually become one of the most powerful sources of energy and power and inspiration for us to do something genuinely new and creative and liberating. And we don't tend to think of tradition in that way. We don't tend to think of tradition as something that empowers us for the future. We tend to think of tradition as something that sort of locks us in the past. And the reason for that, of course, is sometimes church at its worst does exactly that. We take those old stories, we take those old traditions, and we use them to insist that nothing can change. We use those old stories and those old traditions kind of like the South in the United States uses old monuments to lift up people whose beliefs and practices and actions in the past were actually harmful and actually oppressive. In other words, our traditions and our ancient stories can just as easily become oppressive as they can become liberative. And so the trick then for us in the church is to learn how to not turn our traditions and our old stories into monuments that celebrate the wrong thing, but to rather take those traditions and those stories and to tell them as honestly and openly and truly as we can. To not turn them into propaganda like a statue to a Confederate general, but rather to turn them into genuinely inspiring and instructive and empowering stories of liberation. And one of the primary ways we do that is by telling those stories in all of their stark honesty. When we tell the story, for example, of Abram and Isaac and Sarah in this church, we try very hard not to gloss over the difficult things about those stories. Last month when we talked about Hagar and Hagar's son and how they were expelled from the family of Abram and Sarah because Sarah was jealous of Hagar and jealous of her son, we don't excuse that behavior. We don't say that that was good. We admit that those old biblical stories, those old biblical traditions, oftentimes contain actions and words and speech that are genuinely bad. In other words, we don't gloss over those traditions and turn them into propaganda. We embrace the hard truth of those traditions and use them to compel us and propel us forward so that we can birth something new. I think when church is at its best, it's doing exactly that. We're taking the whole Bible and we're telling these stories faithfully. We're living into these stories the best way that we know how. We're gathering a diverse group of people as a community who will lean into those stories and traditions and tell those stories and traditions honestly and bravely and courageously. And when we do that, like Christ, we create a space of creativity, a space of appearing, a space of new birth, where God can use those old stories as fertile soil and fertile ground for something new to be birthed, for something new to grow. And in that way, I think tradition becomes a genuine resource to us. It becomes a place where God is actually using those traditions to create entirely new traditions that bring about good outcomes of freedom and liberation for people who are otherwise oppressed. This whole series is called Why Church? Because the big question, of course, is why in an age of disillusionment with Christianity and disillusionment with institutions of all kinds, why in a time like this would anybody choose church? And one of my answers to that question is people will choose to be a part of church to the extent that the church learns to use its old traditions and its old stories, not as a form of propaganda for oppressing people, not as a form of propaganda to sort of enslave people, but rather as a soil for growing something genuinely new and something genuinely good. To the extent that we're able to do that as a church, I think people, a whole bunch of different kinds of very diverse people, will want to be a part of any community that is courageous enough and faithful enough to birth new expressions of freedom and liberation in their midst.